Betrayed behind bars, the brutal end of Matthew Phillips. Deep in the American Midwest, the state of Illinois is often seen as a microcosm of the United States itself, a place where urban vibrancy meets rural tranquility and where the echoes of American history reverberate through its cities and towns. From the bustling streets of Chicago to the serene banks of the Mississippi River, Illinois is a state full of contrasts. Yet, hidden away in this heartland is a place that starkly contrasts with the image of peaceful America. The United States Penitentiary Thomson, located in the small town of Thomson, Illinois, is a maximum security federal prison that has become synonymous with violence and brutality. Known for its harsh conditions and volatile atmosphere, the prison houses some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. But it was within these walls that a particularly gruesome event unfolded. An event so horrifying that it left even seasoned prison officials and inmates reeling. This is the story of Matthew Phillips, an inmate whose life was violently taken in a savage assault, his death serving as a grim reminder of the darkness that can thrive behind bars. This is not just a story about a murder, it's a story about systemic failure, unchecked brutality, and the tragic loss of a man who might have had a chance at redemption. Thomson, Illinois, is a small town nestled on the banks of the Mississippi River, known more for its quiet, close-knit community than for anything else. But just outside the town lies a fortress of concrete and steel, the United States Penitentiary Thomson, a place far removed from the town's idyllic reputation. The prison, which was designed to hold some of the country's most dangerous inmates, quickly gained notoriety for its brutal conditions and the violent incidents that seem to occur with alarming regularity. Within this prison is the Special Management Unit, SMU, a section reserved for inmates considered too dangerous or disruptive for the general population. Inmates in the Special Management Unit are double-celled in tiny spaces for nearly 24 hours a day, often with cellmates who have a history of violence or are members of rival gangs. The result is an environment of constant tension and fear, where violence can erupt at any moment. For Matthew Phillips, an inmate who had been transferred to Thomson after being labeled a problem at another facility, the Special Management Unit was a living nightmare. Phillips was not a hardened criminal. His conviction was for a non-violent drug offense, but his time in the prison system had hardened him in ways he never anticipated. Despite his efforts to keep to himself, Phillips became entangled in the deadly dynamics of life in the Special Management Unit, leading to a chain of events that would end in his brutal murder. Matthew Phillips was born into a modest family in a small town in Ohio. His early life was marked by the same struggles that many in his community faced: economic hardship, limited opportunities, and a constant fight to stay afloat. Despite these challenges, Phillips showed promise in his youth. He was a bright student and a hard worker, known for his determination and his desire to build a better life for himself. However, as is often the case in communities ravaged by poverty and lack of resources, Phillips found himself increasingly drawn to the wrong crowd. As he entered his late teens, Phillips began to experiment with drugs. What started as casual use quickly spiraled into a full-blown addiction. Substance abuse took over his life, driving him away from his family and friends and leading him down a dark path. The addiction that once seemed like an escape from the harsh realities of life soon became a prison of its own, trapping Phillips in a cycle of dependency and despair. By his early 20s, Phillips was deeply entrenched in the drug scene. Desperate to support his habit, he turned to selling drugs, a decision that would eventually lead to his downfall. Arrested for possession and distribution, Phillips faced the full weight of the law. The sentence handed down was harsh, reflecting the strict federal guidelines that showed little mercy for those involved in drug-related crimes. For Phillips, this was the moment when everything came crashing down. He had hit rock bottom. In prison, Phillips hoped to find a way to break free from the cycle of addiction that had consumed his life. He sought out programs that could help him turn his life around, and for a time, it seemed as though he might succeed. But prison, as it turned out, was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a place where the strong preyed on the weak, and where survival often meant making alliances with the very people Phillips had hoped to avoid. Phillips' troubles began almost immediately upon his arrival at his initial prison facility. In a place where violence was the norm and respect was earned through intimidation, Phillips struggled to fit in. His attempts to keep to himself were seen as signs of weakness, and he quickly became a target for more aggressive inmates. After a series of incidents, Phillips was labeled a troublemaker by the prison administration, a label that would follow him to his next destination. The decision to transfer Phillips to the United States Penitentiary Thomson, a facility known for its harsh conditions and high levels of violence, was one that would ultimately seal his fate. Thomson's Special Management Unit was a place where danger lurked around every corner. For Phillips, this was a world far removed from any hope of redemption. Phillips' Jewish faith, symbolized by the Star of David tattoo on his chest, made him an immediate target in Thomson. The prison was rife with racial tensions, and white supremacist gangs held significant power. To them, Phillips was more than just another inmate. He was a symbol of everything they despised. Despite his best efforts to avoid conflict, Phillips found himself in a situation where he was constantly under threat. He knew he was in danger, but there was little he could do to protect himself. In his letters to his family, Phillips expressed his fears. He wrote of the hostile environment, the constant threats, and his growing sense of despair. The hope he once had for a new beginning was fading, replaced by the grim reality that he might not survive his sentence. These letters, filled with a mixture of hope and desperation, revealed a man who was struggling to hold on to any semblance of optimism, but they also hinted at a deeper fear, a fear that his time was running out and that he might never get the chance to start over. The days leading up to Matthew Phillips's death were fraught with a palpable sense of unease. The Special Management Unit at Thomson was always a tense environment, but in those final days, the tension was nearly unbearable. Inmates in the SMU had begun to whisper among themselves, murmurs of something brewing, a storm of violence on the horizon. These whispers spread quickly, carrying with them a sense of dread that was hard to ignore. The air in the unit was thick with apprehension, and even the guards seemed on edge, their usual tough demeanor giving way to a quiet wariness. Phillips, in particular, felt the weight of these tensions bearing down on him. He had never felt safe at Thomson, but now that sense of danger was more acute than ever. He knew that his very presence in the SMU was a provocation to the white supremacist inmates who viewed him with contempt. To them, Phillips, with his Jewish faith and the Star of David tattooed on his chest, was more than just another inmate. He was an affront to their twisted beliefs, a target for their hatred. The knowledge of this made every day in the SMU a battle for survival, each hour filled with the fear that he might not live to see the next. As the days passed, that fear grew stronger. Phillips could feel the hostility around him intensifying, could see it in the way the other inmates looked at him with narrowed eyes and barely concealed malice. The guards, too, seemed to sense the growing danger, but they did nothing to ease the tension. Instead, they remained detached, their indifference only adding to the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the unit. Phillips was left to navigate this hostile environment on his own, the sense of isolation amplifying his anxiety. Then came the day when the tension finally reached its breaking point. It started like any other day in the SMU, with the same monotonous routines and the same sense of impending doom. But there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that made the usual routine feel more ominous. Phillips was moved to a recreation cage, a small, enclosed space where inmates were allowed limited time out of their cells. But this time, he was not alone. Waiting for him in the cage were two other inmates, both known members of a violent white supremacist gang. The decision to place Phillips with these men was either a gross oversight or a deliberate act of cruelty. The guards, who should have known better, failed to consider or chose to ignore the potential consequences of such a move. Perhaps they were simply negligent, indifferent to the lives they were responsible for, or perhaps it was something more sinister, a calculated decision to put Phillips in harm's way. Whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. Phillips was placed in a situation from which there was no escape. The attack began almost as soon as the cage door slammed shut. The two gang members, who had likely been waiting for this moment, wasted no time in launching their assault. They attacked Phillips with a ferocity that was both brutal and inhuman, their hatred fueling every blow. They had come prepared, armed with improvised weapons, shanks fashioned from sharpened metal, designed to inflict maximum damage. These makeshift knives were not just tools of violence, they were instruments of torture, intended to prolong the suffering of their victim. Phillips tried to defend himself, but he was outnumbered and overpowered. The attackers showed no mercy, stabbing him repeatedly, each thrust of their weapons punctuated by their shouts of rage. The blows were delivered with brutal precision, aimed at vital organs and soft tissue to ensure that the wounds would be fatal. Blood sprayed across the cage, splattering the walls and pooling on the floor as Phillips's strength began to ebb away. The pain was excruciating, every nerve in his body screaming in agony as the life was slowly and violently drained from him. The guards, who were supposed to be monitoring the situation, did nothing to intervene. Whether out of shock, fear, or deliberate malice, they remained outside the cage, watching as the attack unfolded. The other inmates, too, were silent witnesses to the brutality, their usual bravado subdued by the sheer horror of what they were seeing. In the end, Phillips was left alone, a broken and bloodied figure lying in a pool of his own blood, his body convulsing as he took his final, ragged breaths. The aftermath was as grim as the attack itself. Phillips' body was a testament to the brutality he had endured. Stab wounds covered his torso, neck, and face, each one a reminder of the hatred that had driven his attackers to such inhuman lengths. His blood soaked the floor of the cage, a stark contrast to the cold, grey concrete that had been his prison. The guards finally moved in, but it was far too late. Phillips was gone, his life violently snuffed out in a place where violence reigned supreme. His death was not just a tragedy, it was an indictment of a system that had failed him at every turn. The death of Matthew Phillips caused a storm of shock and outrage, both within the prison walls and beyond. How could such a brutal and calculated attack occur in a facility that was supposedly under constant surveillance? The gruesome nature of his death raised serious questions about the management of the United States Penitentiary Thomson and the decisions that led to Phillips being placed in such a perilous situation. The fact that he was left in the recreation cage with known violent offenders, despite the evident risks, was seen by many as a gross failure of the prison's duty to protect those in its care. For Phillips's family, the news of his death was a devastating blow. They had held on to the hope that he might survive his sentence and emerge from prison with a chance to start anew, free from the addiction and mistakes that had haunted his past. Instead, they were faced with the unimaginable, the loss of their son in the most violent and senseless manner possible. When they arrived at the mortuary to identify his body, they were met with an additional layer of horror. The once familiar face of their son was so disfigured by the savage attack that they could hardly recognize him. The physical damage was so severe that it was almost impossible to reconcile the broken, bloodied figure before them with the man they had known and loved. The Bureau of Prisons quickly launched an investigation into the incident, but the results were frustratingly predictable. While the investigation led to the suspension of several guards and placed the warden under intense scrutiny, the deeper, systemic issues within the prison system were largely ignored. The blame was shifted, and the more profound questions about the culture of violence and neglect within Thomson went unanswered. For Phillips's family, these actions amounted to little more than a hollow gesture. Their son was gone, taken from them in a brutal act of violence, and no investigation or suspension could bring him back. Their grief was compounded by the sense that justice had not truly been served, and that the system that was supposed to protect their son had failed him in the most fundamental way. The investigation into Matthew Phillips' death unearthed a dark and tangled web of negligence, corruption, and systemic failure within the United States Penitentiary Thomson. What began as a routine inquiry into an inmate's murder quickly spiraled into a scandal that exposed the rot at the core of the prison's operations. It became clear that the guards were not only aware of the tensions between Phillips and his attackers, but had willfully ignored the imminent danger he was in. Even more damning were the reports that suggested some guards had actively encouraged the conflict, believing that by allowing the violence to unfold, they could teach Phillips a lesson or simply assert their dominance over the inmates. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against the guards mounted. Testimonies from other inmates painted a grim picture of a prison where the line between the guards and the criminals they were supposed to control was perilously thin. There were allegations that the guards had made offhand comments about letting nature take its course and had deliberately turned a blind eye to the brewing conflict in the SMU. These revelations sparked outrage, not just within the prison, but across the nation as the media picked up the story. The two attackers were quickly identified and charged with murder, and their trial became a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed, with every seat taken by members of the press, activists, and observers eager to see justice served. The prosecution was relentless, painting a vivid and horrifying picture of life in Thomson. They described a place where violence was not just common, but expected, a place where the strong preyed on the weak with impunity, and where guards, tasked with maintaining order, often acted as enablers of the chaos. Witnesses were called to the stand, each testimony more harrowing than the last. Inmates who had lived in constant fear of their lives recounted the terror of being locked away in the SMU, knowing that, at any moment, they could become the next target. Some guards, too, broke ranks, describing the toxic culture within the prison, where turning a blind eye to violence was seen as just another part of the job. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, the air thick with the weight of the testimonies that laid bare the brutality of the system. The defense, faced with overwhelming evidence, attempted to argue that the attack was an unfortunate consequence of life in a maximum security prison. They claimed that the environment was inherently violent and that their clients had simply been caught up in a situation beyond their control, but their arguments fell flat. The prosecution had made it clear that this was not just about the environment. This was about a deliberate act of murder, facilitated by a culture of negligence and cruelty. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, the courtroom buzzing with nervous anticipation. When the verdict was finally read, there was a collective intake of breath. The attackers were found guilty of murder, and the sentence was swift and severe: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision ensured that these men would never again walk free, their lives now confined to the same system that had bred their violence. For Phillips's family, the verdict brought a bittersweet sense of justice. They had fought for months to see those responsible for their son's death held accountable, and now, at last, they had some closure. But the trial had also reopened their wounds, forcing them to relive the horror of their son's death in excruciating detail. The pain of their loss was still fresh, and while the verdict provided a measure of justice, it could never undo the tragedy that had befallen them. The courtroom emptied, the cameras turned off, but for Phillips's family, the grief lingered long after the trial was over. The death of Matthew Phillips highlighted the deep-seated issues within the Bureau of Prisons and the broader American prison system. The conditions at Thomson were not unique. Similar stories of violence, neglect, and systemic failure have emerged from prisons across the country. Phillips's death became a symbol of the need for reform, a rallying cry for those who seek to overhaul a system that too often fails to protect those in its care. In the aftermath of the trial, the calls for reform within the American prison system grew louder and more urgent. Advocacy groups, fueled by the outrage over Matthew Phillips's death, once again pushed for systemic changes. They demanded increased oversight of prison facilities, the implementation of safer conditions for inmates, and a fundamental shift away from the deeply entrenched punitive mindset that currently dominates the US correctional system. These groups argued that prisons should focus on rehabilitation and human dignity, rather than simply serving as warehouses for the nation's most vulnerable and troubled individuals. Despite these impassioned pleas, meaningful change has been frustratingly slow to materialize. The cycle of violence and neglect within prisons like Thomson continues, with the system often failing those it is supposed to rehabilitate. The stories of inmates, like Matthew Phillips, who sought redemption but found only violence and death, highlight the deep flaws in a system more concerned with punishment than with offering a path to recovery. Matthew Phillips's death serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of such a system. He was a man who, despite his past mistakes, deserved the opportunity to rebuild his life, a chance that was brutally taken from him in the most horrific way imaginable. His story forces us to confront the harsh realities of our prison system and compels us to ask, how many more lives must be lost before we acknowledge and address the failures of a system that too often prioritizes control over compassion, punishment over rehabilitation? As we reflect on his tragic end, the urgency for reform becomes ever clearer. Do you have the guts to handle another crazy murder story? Click here to dive deeper into this new horror.